America was on its way, the most advanced industrialized country in the world. From 1860 to 1900, the U.S. economy grew 400%. The country was growing, railroads connected the nation, and steel was building up cities all around the country. In 1900, the U.S. was controlled by businessmen like J.P. Morgan, who ruled the railroads, Andrew Carnegie, who manufactured steel for these railroads, and John D. Rockefeller, who provided kerosene that lit up America. All the country cared about was becoming industrialized faster than the rest of the world. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan's industrial interests were strongly aligned. In order to keep their industries moving forward, they conspired to attain an even greater power. They quietly used their money to buy the campaign for the presidential candidate who would allow them to continue their vast control over businesses with minimal government regulations. Essentially, in 1896, these three men, Morgan, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, bought themselves a United States president, William McKinley. With McKinley as president, the tycoons thought they would be able to continue to grow their vast empires, but what they did not expect was that President McKinley would be shot dead 6 months into his second term. The new president was Theodore Roosevelt, a man who, unlike McKinley, was not afraid of the American tycoons of industry, Morgan, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. Roosevelt thought America should be a country and not a company. He thought the people should be in charge of the country, not just the rich. Roosevelt believed he was the voice of the people, so when he took office by accident in 1901, Roosevelt began an endeavor to take back the country from the tycoons.
Roosevelt, who took over from a pretty conservative Republican because he was a vice president, and they kind of stuck him as in the vice presidency to hide him because he was too progressive, too liberal. And all of a sudden he becomes president, and they say, "Oh no, now we got that cowboy in the White House," and he became a real spokesperson for progressive, liberal, populist, government.
Roosevelt was from a privileged background, the son of a well-to-do businessman born in New York. As a child, Roosevelt was asthmatic. With fresh air and rigorous exercise, he became healthy and strong. He developed a love for the outdoors, which led him later to reinvent himself in the Badlands of South Dakota. He became a cowboy, now a cowboy with a Tiffany hunting knife, but still a cowboy. Upon his return to New York in politics, he landed the job as president of the New York City Board of Police. There he earned the reputation for cleaning up corruption by fearlessly standing up to the party bosses. This experience was important proving ground because in only a few short years, he found himself in a standoff with the three most powerful men in America, but Roosevelt was the fourth. Not long after Teddy Roosevelt took office, he was forced to recognize the growing tensions between the Pennsylvania coal miners and the man who owned those mines, Andrew Carnegie. The machinery that processed steel was run by coal. The railroads were run by coal. People's homes were now being heated by coal instead of firewood. But while coal was essential for the new way of American life and industry, getting the coal was hard and dangerous work. The miners worked long hours for little pay, and 1 in 5 miners were killed by work-related injuries, and many miners would later contract deadly black lung disease from breathing coal dust. For example, in 1897 at the Latimer coal mine, while workers were protesting these bad conditions, the foreman shot and killed 19 unarmed striking coal miners. It was called the Latimer Massacre. The conditions and the way these miners were treated continued to deteriorate. In July of 1902, 112 miners were killed by an explosion. By December 1902, over 100,000 coal miners were on strike for better conditions and better pay. The mining industry had ground to a halt. The Northeast was facing a freezing winter, with no fuel for warmth, and the titans of industry would not give in. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan were operating in a free market economy. These businesses had too much power and control of what goes out to the people and what doesn't. Roosevelt's dilemma was this: was business allowed to ignore human suffering because it was not profitable? Roosevelt was not going to let the American people freeze to death for lack of fuel, nor would he allow the miners to risk their lives digging for coal because they needed the job. Roosevelt took a new stance. The government was in charge. Teddy actually loved business. Industry and self-made men were some of his favorite things to see in the world. His father had been a businessman. He himself had seen the landscape of the Western expansion and was proud of American progress. The industrialists had accelerated America to a new place of power. What his campaign was against was the companies who tried to completely control one industry, preventing others from making money off of one certain product, such as Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil, or J.P. Morgan's railroads. Perhaps it was the shadowy wake of the Civil War, less than 40 years ago, and utter chaos of human devastation it had created, that reaffirmed Roosevelt's resolve. Roosevelt would have been graciously described as a confident man. Critics might have called him arrogant. So he was the perfect person to challenge the authority of the almighty dollar. The attitude Teddy showed was that he was stronger than these men, and he was going to prove it. Roosevelt knew that government had the right to make essential products available to everyone, which went against these businessmen's strategies. And because Teddy knew that he was right and they were wrong, he knew he had to make a change. Roosevelt threatened to send in militia and eventually bargained for a 10% wage increase for the workers. His settlement, which started the coal mines back up, was hugely important because it gave people a chance to buy coal to heat their homes before winter, which may have saved the lives of countless people. Who knows what would have happened to America that winter if Teddy hadn't taken action. Prompted by the national coal scare and Roosevelt's rescue, by mid-December in 1902, aggressive antitrust legislation was finally introduced into both houses of Congress. The industrialist tycoons of yesterday were about to go down. With the support of Congress finally and fully behind him, Roosevelt began his trust busting. He formulated 44 different lawsuits against companies using the Sherman Antitrust Act, an act stating that no one company could monopolize a certain product. Roosevelt made sure there would always be competition between businesses, and that no one business could control an entire industry like the coal industry. Roosevelt was tearing down big corporations, which triggered the start-off of small businesses taking the place of monopolies. Teddy gave small businesses a chance to survive. Teddy showed people that the government should be running the country. He thought the people should have a bigger say in what happens to the country. Teddy Roosevelt believed that if the government had less power than business, then the country could be manipulated by these big businesses. He saw these businesses as the cause of such a big gap between the poor middle class and the supported upper class. His amount of success was noticeable. He was able to break up J.P. Morgan's railroads and shut down the empire John D. Rockefeller had been putting together for years, separating his oil companies and his steel plants, which he had purchased from Carnegie. The men who had formed this country with their own two hands were being stripped of their unfair strategies and forced to make a living the way everyone else did. Teddy was able to scare the three most powerful people in America, and he took them head-on in the battle for control over America. The American people supported Roosevelt because of his fairness and belief that American citizens should have the power, instead of the America's richest having control. He called this the Square Deal. This revolution brought back a strong middle class and helped to close the gap between rich and poor. we're still talking about that gap today.
It's just me